Who is Marwan Barghouti, the man whose release has been demanded by Hamas as part of any potential ceasefire deal? Often dubbed Palestine's Nelson Mandela, is he a terrorist or a political leader who Palestinian factions could unite around? In 2004, Marwan was sentenced to 5 life terms in prison. But what was his crime? And is his imprisonment an indication of Israel's unwillingness to engage Palestinians in meaningful negotiations?
The way that Marwan was arrested, it wasn't an arrest, it was a kidnap from Palestine, from Palestinian territory. The way that he was kept in solitary confinement for 1,000 days. The way that he was convicted, his trial does not stand up to international law.
Let's start at the beginning. Marwan was born in the village of Kobar near Ramallah in 1959. 8 years before Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza in the 1967 war. When he was just 12 years old, Israeli soldiers shot his pet dog during a military sweep of the village. Many close to him cite that this traumatic childhood experience pushed him to take an interest in politics and take steps towards ending the Israeli occupation. 3 years later, at the age of 15, Marwan became an active member of the Fatah youth movement. Fatah is a major Palestinian political party and the largest faction of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was founded in the late 1950s by Yasser Arafat, Khalil al-Wazir and others. Now, the youth movement, or the Fatah student movement, was the official student branch of the party that recruited young Palestinians, especially students, in support of Fatah's nationalist goals and resistance against Israeli occupation. They operated and arranged demonstrations in Palestinian universities, schools and youth centres in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. His involvement with the Fatah Youth Party led to his first arrest in 1978. He was jailed by Israel on charges of being involved with armed Palestinian groups for more than 4 years. While in jail, Barghouti completed his secondary education and learned Hebrew. Following his release in 1983, he returned to the West Bank to enroll at Birzeit University and earn his bachelor's degree in history and political science. But it wasn't until 11 years later, in 1994, that he finished his studies because he remained politically active. Which brings us to the First Intifada, the large-scale Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation that began in December 1987 and lasted until September 1993. By 1987, Palestinians had been living under Israel's occupation for 20 years. There was a lot of frustration. Not only were Palestinians struggling economically, but illegal settlements in the West Bank had been spreading and Palestinians were having frequent confrontations with Israeli soldiers. On December 9, 1987, in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, an Israeli truck collided with a civilian car, killing 4 Palestinian workers. Palestinians believe Israel deliberately targeted the workers, and in response, protests broke out in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp. The uprising spread to the West Bank, where Marwan Barghouti was a key figure leading demonstrations, protests and boycotts. Israel accused him of inciting violence, and he was arrested by Israeli authorities and exiled to Jordan. Israel was internationally condemned for being excessively violent in its crackdown of the Intifada. Palestinian protesters were mainly unarmed, with some throwing rocks at Israeli tanks and soldiers, and on rare occasions, Molotov cocktails. According to Amnesty International, Israeli forces killed Palestinians unlawfully by shooting them during demonstrations and at checkpoints, although lives were not in danger. They shelled residential areas and committed extrajudicial executions. Palestinian armed groups and individuals killed Israeli civilians by placing bombs in crowded places and in drive-by shootings. The Intifada lasted for 6 years, and more than 100 Israelis and 1,200 Palestinians were killed, and over 16,000 Palestinians were arrested and tortured. In 1994, Barghouti returned to the West Bank after the Oslo Accords were signed. The Oslo Accords were a series of agreements signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization that established a framework for peace negotiations. The Accords recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and Israel's right to exist. It led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority to govern Palestinians in parts of the occupied territories, and was intended to be an interim arrangement leading to a final peace settlement within 5 years. Barghouti served as an advisor on the Oslo Accords and was a supporter of the peace process. He also took the role of Fatah's Secretary General in the West Bank. In 1998, he gained a Master's in International Relations and maintained his focus on liberating Palestinians. Despite the aftermath of the First Intifada, Marwan had a unique ability to unite Palestinians. But it became increasingly clear to Marwan that Israel had no intention of honouring the Oslo Accords. He began advocating for a combination of negotiations and resistance to pressure Israel to fulfill its commitments under the Accords. 28 September 2000, the Second Intifada began and lasted for 5 years. Barghouti became a leader of Fatah in the West Bank and head of its armed wing Tanzim. He led marches to Israeli checkpoints and was accused of inciting riots against Israeli soldiers. Israel also accused him of being a senior member of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, an organization that conducted attacks and suicide bombings. They accused Marwan of directing some of the bombings personally. Many key Palestinian leaders were assassinated during this intifada. In 2001, Marwan survived an Israeli assassination attempt, but he was arrested in Ramallah in 2002 after the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade issued a statement naming him as their leader. He appeared in an Israeli court the following August, charged with the killing of 26 people and belonging to a terrorist organization.
The way that he was convicted, his trial does not stand up to international law. We did numerous interviews with lawyers, one of whom from the International Parliamentary Union, Simon Foreman, who's in the film, who was there during the trial and monitored it all, and he said absolutely nothing stands up to international law.
Barghouti has consistently denied involvement in attacks against Israeli civilians, though he supported armed resistance against the Israeli occupation, which is legal under international law.
Everybody in this world knows that Marwan Barghouti is fighting for peace. I am a peace man. I was trying to do everything for the peace between the two peoples.
Marwan was a figure that Israel could work with because they had worked with him during the Oslo Peace Accords. And Yossi Beilin, who's a former Israeli government official, a minister of security, had worked with Marwan on the Oslo Peace Accords, so he knew him personally and professionally. Said on many occasions that he had campaigned for his release from day one.
In 2004, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms in prison and spent the first 1,000 days, more than 3 years, in solitary confinement. But his political activism didn't stop. He continued to read and educate himself and educate fellow prisoners. In 2009, while in prison, he was elected to Fatah's Central Committee. Fast forward to 2017, he led a mass hunger strike of Palestinian prisoners protesting their dire conditions that lasted 43 days. After 20 years in prison, he is still an influential voice amongst Palestinians, calling for an end to Israeli occupation, the establishment of an independent state, and key to reviving peace negotiations. Since October 7, he has been subject to even harsher treatment. According to this article by The Guardian, Barghouti told his lawyers in March that earlier that month, he was dragged to an area of the prison without security cameras and assaulted. He recalled bleeding from the nose as he was dragged across the floor by his handcuffs before he was beaten unconscious. Kadura Faris, head of the Palestinian Prisoners and Former Detainees Commission, said, "During this war, the Israeli authorities are trying to deal with all prisoners in a way that allows them to get revenge on Palestinians. They understand what they represent in our collective mind. They are symbols of the struggle." While Barghouti's release has been demanded by Hamas as part of any potential ceasefire deal, and he is seen by many as crucial for unifying Palestinians and reviving peace efforts, Israel views him as a terrorist and is wary of his popularity and ability to mobilise Palestinians. Marwan Barghouti plans to run for the next Palestinian presidential elections. The last presidential election was held on January 9, 2005. To date, polls consistently show that Marwan would be the most popular candidate in any upcoming presidential election.